What happens when a man who's spent his whole life fixing other people's broken roads is suddenly seen for the first time? On a freezing night, Frank Harlan, a 68-year-old Army veteran, turned small-town mechanic, quietly saves 2 stranded officers, asking nothing in return. Days later, headlights return to his lonely shop, but not for repairs. One by one, patrol cars fill his yard, carrying thanks he never expected, memories he thought were buried, and a gift that shakes the toughest man in town. It's a story of quiet service finally answered, of solitude breaking open into connection. Would you be ready if gratitude came back to find you? At the very edge of town, where the last gas station gives way to miles of farmland and low rolling hills, there stands a small garage of block walls and tin roof, its single bay door painted the color of primer and salt. The paint is long since dulled, but it is clean. Everything about the place is. The hand-lettered sign above the door simply says, Harlan's Auto, black on white, no phone number, no web address. It is the sort of shop you only find if you already know it's there. Inside, warmth lives not in decor but in order. Metal tool chests line one wall, their drawers labeled in careful handwriting. A wood stove smolders in the corner, fed with split oak from the pile behind the building. The air smells of oil and cold iron, but also of coffee, strong and black. Always fresh by 6 a.m. Frank Harlan rises before the sun, as he has for decades. The old army habit never left him. At 68, his back is a little slower to straighten in the morning, but the day's pattern remains precise. Coffee pot on first, logbook opened on the counter second, door unlocked and rolled up before the sky lightens. He stands for a moment, most mornings at the threshold of his shop, letting the cold air wash over him, hands already dark with permanent oil stains that no soap ever reached. Then he moves inside with the quiet economy of a man who long ago learned that wasted motion costs time. Frank's ledger is a wide, heavy book, the kind you cannot buy at big stores anymore. Each page is ruled and headed by date in square, block letters. He prints with the patience of a draftsman. Customer name, vehicle, work done, parts cost, no extra flourish, no shorthand. The army taught him to keep records, the same way it taught him to keep engines alive. Exactness saves lives. Over the years, hundreds of names have passed across those pages. Farm trucks, old sedans, school buses, the occasional state trooper cruiser. Each line tells a quiet story of breakdown and return to service. The shop itself bears the imprint of long service. There's the shadow of his first army unit, still faintly visible in a framed photograph above the bench. Men in cold weather gear, grease-stained but grinning beside a half-tracked vehicle in some forgotten European winter. There are medals tucked in a drawer somewhere, though he rarely opens it. Frank was a master sergeant before he came home, the man who kept convoys moving when every mile of road meant life or death. He doesn't speak of it much, but his habits remember. Every wrench is returned to its slot, every part set aside for inspection before disposal. Most days are quiet now. A single pickup might roll in mid. A farmer will ask about a stubborn transmission or a failing alternator. Frank listens more than he talks. He doesn't upsell, doesn't hurry. When the work is done, the handshake is brief but sincere. Payment is cash or check. The receipt, if asked for, is handwritten on carbon copy pads, older than the young men who sometimes stop for air in their tires. Outside, the highway hums faintly with passing trucks, but no one really stops unless they need to. The garage sits low against the wind, and on winter days, snow piles in drifts along the ditch. Frank keeps a broom by the door to clear the steps, and an old radio hums behind him. Not music so much as quiet voices, weather reports, the steady tick of passing hours. It is a life pared down to essentials: service, order, quiet. After decades spent under orders, Frank has found a different kind of command of his own space, his own time. There's a dignity in it, though no one says so aloud. The shop is both refuge and outpost, a place where broken things arrive, and more often than not, leave whole again. On that December morning when the story begins, nothing suggested that anything would change. The stove ticked inside. The ledger lay open to a fresh page. Frank sipped his coffee and checked his watch. An old army issue with a cracked crystal but a perfect sweep. Outside, the sky was a flat, pale gray, and a sharp wind rattled the aluminum siding. He set his mug down, wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days, and turned back to the waiting tools. Another day, another engine, another quiet entry in the book. It was a rhythm as reliable as sunrise. But in less than 24 hours, the steady pattern would break, not with disaster, but with headlights cutting through the dusk, and a knock at his door that would set a new story in motion. One Frank Harlan never asked for, and never expected. Night comes early on the highway in winter. By late afternoon the light thins to a silver haze, and by 6 the road is an empty ribbon where the wind drags bits of paper and dry grass across the asphalt. Frank Harlan had closed his bay door, but stayed inside. He often lingered after dark, finishing whatever job the day had left half. That evening it was a stubborn pickup with a cracked head gasket, the sort of patient work that demanded time and silence. The stove glowed low and red behind him. It was quiet enough to hear the hum of his fluorescent lights, and the scrape of his wrench against a manifold. That quiet broke suddenly with the distant wail of tires on gravel and a flicker of blue light on the far wall. Frank's hands paused mid-turn. Out here, sirens were rare. Police cruisers didn't often drift this far beyond town, unless something serious had happened on the road. The vehicle came slow, laboring. Its engine coughed, caught, then coughed again. The glow of headlights cut through the shop's small front windows before swinging wide into his lot. Frank wiped his hands and went to the door, just as the cruiser rolled to a stop. It was an older Ford Interceptor, paint dulled by years of patrol. Steam hissed from under the hood, and one of the headlights was dim, as if water had seeped in. 2 officers climbed out into the cold. They were young, younger than his own sons would have been. One with his duty coat zipped to the chin, the other with only a thin pair of gloves. They looked tired, faces pale from hours on the road. The taller one raised a hand in greeting, careful, respectful. "Evening, sir. Sorry to bother you this late." "She's dying on us," he said, nodding toward the cruiser. His voice carried a trace of nerves, like he wasn't sure if the man behind the door was friendly or not. Frank swung the door wide. The smell of coolant hit him before the wind did. "Bring it in," he said simply, stepping aside. The officers glanced at each other, surprised but relieved, then climbed back in and coaxed the car forward until its nose crossed the lip of the bay. Frank didn't ask questions right away. He listened to the uneven idle, the squeal in the front of the engine. "Pop the hood," he said after a moment. The younger officer obeyed, fumbling with the latch. Steam rose into the warm shop air. With practiced ease, Frank took a flashlight and leaned in. He moved slowly, but with purpose, hands brushing hoses, tracing belts, reading the engine like a map he'd memorized years ago. Water pump failing. Radiator seemed sweating green. Transmission fluid thin and dark. A day's work at least. Maybe 2. And the department's budget probably stretched thin this late in the year. He didn't speak those thoughts. Instead, he asked, "You on shift now?" "Midnight watch," the tall one answered. "We were heading back to town." Gauge spiked, then smoke. Frank grunted and stepped back. He studied their faces briefly. They were cold, anxious but polite, not entitled, just stranded. He'd been stranded before, in worse places than this. "Leave it here tonight," Frank said finally. "I'll have you running by morning." One of the officers hesitated. "Sir, we don't know if we can just cover the parts," Frank said, cutting him off gently but firm. "Labor's on me." The two looked at each other, unsure whether they'd heard right. Then relief flickered, quiet but deep. They started to protest, but Frank shook his head once. The conversation ended, as they gathered their gear and signed the barest of notes for his ledger. Unit 432 scrawled at the top. The blue lights no longer flashed. Only the red glow of his stove lit the garage walls. Frank walked them out, watched their boots crunch away down the frozen gravel toward a ride one of them had arranged by radio. When the night settled again, the shop felt different. The car steamed gently in the cooling bay. Frank shut off the lights one by one, last to the office where his open ledger waited. He wrote the date, the briefest entry, PD radiator. Belts no charge labor. Then he closed the book with a quiet snap. Outside, the cruiser sat silent but safe. In town, the young officers would talk about the old man who helped without question. Here, Frank turned down the stove and stepped into the cold, unaware how far that small kindness would travel before it found its way back to him. By dawn, the shop was alive again, though the world outside still slept under a lid of low, cold sky. Frank arrived early, as always. The cruiser from the night before waited where the young officers had left it, parked straight and neat. Hood latched but still wet with frost. Its black paint had dulled to charcoal overnight. And the words, "Police" across the side were ghosted by condensation. Frank's breath hung white in the bay as he rolled the big door open. He wheeled his tool cart forward, movements unhurried, but sure. The first step in any job was simple. Look, listen, read the machine before laying hands on it. He circled the car slowly, eyes narrowing at scuffs on the bumper and salt crust in the wheel wells. He had worked on hundreds of vehicles since retiring from the army motor pool, but police cars carried a different weight. They lived hard lives, constant idling, sudden acceleration, long, cold hours. He slid behind the wheel and turned the key just enough to wake the dash, but not the engine. Warning lights glowed amber and red. Temperature gauge still pegged hot, though the engine was stone cold. Not a good sign. He popped the hood and propped it high, letting a gust of frigid air chase away lingering steam. With a flashlight clenched between his teeth, Frank leaned in. The water pump was all but gone. Seal cracked a faint green crust where coolant had dried in streaks. The serpentine belt hung slack and glazed, fibers showing at the edges. He traced a finger along the upper radiator hose. It felt soft, weak, as if ready to burst. The transmission dipstick came up dark and burnt. Somewhere lower, near the crossmember, a slow drip of something thick marked the concrete. He made notes as he worked. Small tight script on a scrap of paper. Parts numbers came to him automatically. He'd memorized half the Napa catalog decades ago. He measured slack in the belt with calipers, checked pulleys, tested fan clutch movement. A good mechanic sees beyond the obvious, knows that when one thing fails, others are close behind. The shop stayed quiet, but for the occasional click of cooling metal and the radio murmuring low from its perch near the office. Frank shut it off after the weather report. He preferred the silence. Machines speak better without competition. At the bench he laid out what he'd need: pump, belt, coolant, hose, clamps, fluid. He checked his shelves first. An orderly world of labeled bins and cardboard boxes. Miraculously, most of what the cruiser needed he already had. Leftovers from jobs past. For the rest, he'd drive into town after lunch. He paused once, studying the old army photo on the wall, himself 30 years younger, grease-smeared and grinning under a steel helmet. The kind men wore when repairing engines with artillery still somewhere near. Keeping things running then had been life and death. Out here now, it was just miles and shifts. But the work felt the same in his hands. Patient, necessary, unsung. Frank ran one last test, turning the engine briefly. It coughed awake, sputtered, and rattled. A harsh protest. He shut it down quickly and let the silence return. There was no rushing a proper fix. He would strip it down, clean every seat and surface, build it back right so those kids wouldn't find themselves stranded on some midnight road. Before heading out for parts, he wrote in his ledger, careful letters on a fresh page. PD Unit 432. Inspection complete. Water pump, belt hose, trans fluid. He left the cost column blank for now. He hadn't changed his mind. When he locked the bay to go into town, the cruiser sat hood up, steam long gone, awaiting hands that knew exactly where to touch. Frank climbed into his own old Ford, its seat molded to his shape after years of quiet miles. He didn't think about the night visit beyond its mechanical facts. 2 stranded cops, 1 tired car, another repair. Another line in the book, nothing more, or so it seemed, by midday. The low clouds had thickened, and snow came in light, restless flurries across the highway. Frank drove back from town with a cardboard box belted into the passenger seat. New water pump, serpentine belt, fresh clamps, 2 gallons of coolant, and a jug of transmission fluid. The radio said the storm might hold off until nightfall, but he'd learned not to trust forecasts. In Europe, long ago, winter had its own timetable. He treated it the same now. The garage felt warm when he rolled back in. He set the box on the bench, stripped off his gloves, and poured coffee from the dented puck. A long sip, then work. He moved with deliberate economy, every step a habit worn into bone. Drain coolant, unbolt the failing pump. Scrape the gasket clean until the block shone bare. The serpentine belt came free with a whispering snap, brittle where it should have flexed, as he worked. The question surfaced again. Bill or no bill? He could charge the department easily standard hourly rate, parts plus labor. On paper, it would be nothing extraordinary. Shops did it every day. Yet the picture of those 2 young officers last night wouldn't fade. The smaller one's fingers had been red and raw from cold. The taller one's boots looked issued, not personal, soles worn slick. They were kids, really. And maybe their department's budget was thinner than folks assumed. Frank paused with wrench in hand and stared at the cruiser's grill. He'd been their age once, driving battered trucks that should have been junked, keeping convoys alive because someone had to. Men far from home depended on engines more than they admitted. He'd done things back then for no pay, but the knowledge that it might keep someone alive one more day. Money hadn't driven the work. Duty had. It wasn't that the town owed him. Frank had chosen his quiet life after discharge. He liked it that way. But something about those two, how they'd stood waiting to see if they'd even be welcome, how relief softened their guarded faces when he'd said leave it, touched a place in him that still remembered long, dark roads and the fear of being stuck. He set the wrench down and leaned on the fender, coffee cup warm in his hand. Outside the bay door, the snow swept sideways, and the sky was a dull pewter. Inside, the shop felt smaller, almost intimate. He thought about the ledger, all those neat entries, so many names and vehicles. How rarely anyone came back just to say thanks, and how little it mattered to him. The work was its own reward. Decision made. He returned to the engine. Fresh pump bolted on. New belt tensioned just right. Hoses cut clean and snug on their clamps. He filled the radiator slowly, burping air pockets out, like a man coaxing breath into something that wanted to live. Transmission fluid next. Rich red, where the old had been black. When the work was finished, he wiped his hands and checked everything twice. The cruiser started on the first turn, a smooth hum now replacing the harsh cough. Temperature held steady just below halfway. Heat poured from the vents. The car would no longer betray its riders on an empty road. Frank shut it down and stood for a moment, quiet satisfaction settling over him. On the counter, his scrap notes lay beside the parts receipts. He tucked the receipts into the ledger, but left the labor column empty. He wrote only parts covered. That small act, a blank line where dollars might have gone, felt right. It wasn't charity. It was one craftsman to another, a silent favor paid forward. No one would know but the two young men who'd driven away in the cold. Outside, the snow swirled thicker. Frank closed up the shop, flipped the sign to closed for the evening, and stepped into the cold to lock the bay. He glanced once at the cruiser, now whole and quiet, waiting for its owners to return. The day's decision felt small, almost invisible, but somewhere deep inside a gear had shifted. One act of quiet service, setting in motion something he could not yet see. The next morning broke still gray and bitter. Snow had stopped falling, but the wind scoured the open flats beyond the shop, lifting white plumes off the highway. Frank came in earlier than usual, shoulders hunched against the cold, boots leaving narrow tracks across the lot. He raised the bay door, letting in a blast of air sharp enough to bite his lungs. The cruiser waited where he had left it, engine bay open like a patient mid-surgery. He went straight to work. The night had dropped temperatures well below freezing. Every tool felt like ice when he touched it. Still, his hands moved with the easy precision of long practice. Bolts came off one by one, knuckles scraping only once on a stubborn pulley. He talked softly to the machine, not words exactly, more small hums and sighs as he checked and rechecked his work. From time to time he stepped to the stove, fed it another stick of oak, rubbed warmth back into his fingers. Then back under the hood. Tighten here, check torque there, clamp hoses, refill coolant. Each motion done slowly and right the first time. Rushing was how mistakes happened. In the army he'd learned that cold metal could kill faster than bullets if you cut corners. Around mid-morning, a neighbor, Jake Morgan, dropped by for diesel and coffee. He stomped snow from his boots, peered at the black and white cruiser, and gave a low whistle. "PD finally found your place." "Huh." Frank didn't look up. "Cars, just a car." Jake grinned, poured himself coffee, but didn't press. Everyone in town knew better than to ask Frank for stories. The man's past was his own. After a few minutes of quiet small talk about the storm, Jake left, leaving behind the scent of cold wool and tobacco. Work went on. The radiator fought him, its lower hose frozen to the neck. Frank heated it with an old shop lamp, patient until the stubborn seal released with a soft sigh. He replaced the thermostat, though it hadn't fully failed prevention, not repair alone. Transmission fluid drained black and slow, replaced by clean red that glowed in the shop light like something alive. Lunch was an afterthought. Half a sandwich at the workbench, coffee reheated on the stove. While he ate, Frank took a moment to look over the cruiser's tires, brake lines, and battery cables. He hadn't promised to do more than get it running, but old instincts pressed him to check everything. He pictured those young officers on empty back roads. "A dead battery out here could be worse than any call," they answered. By early afternoon, the job neared completion. He fired the engine once, let it run, watched for leaks. The idle steadied, deep and strong. Steam stayed where it belonged. Heat rolled from the vents, windshield clearing itself in slow arcs. Satisfied, Frank shut it down and reached for a rag to wipe his hands. He wrote in the ledger again. "PD Unit 432 parts replaced. Pump, belt, thermostat, hoses, ATF, labor, no charge." Then he underlined the date, something he rarely did. Outside the storm lightened a little, sun a pale disk behind thin clouds. Frank walked around the car once more, tapping each tire, checking caps, running his palm across the fender. A craftsman's final inspection. By the time dusk edged in, the cruiser was whole again. Hood shut, windshield wiped clear of frost. Frank turned off the lights. But before he left, he paused by the driver's door. His reflection looked back, lined, gray, but steady. He tapped the hood once with his knuckles. A small salute to a job done right. He did not know who might return to claim the car, or when. That didn't matter. The work was finished. The road ahead for whoever drove it a little safer. In the quiet of the closing shop, Frank felt the same quiet satisfaction that had carried him through long convoys and cold nights, half a world away. Keep them moving, no matter what. Late the next morning, just as Frank was finishing a set of brake pads on a farmer's truck, the sound of tires on gravel returned. This time there were no sirens, only the steady hum of an engine and the muted crunch of wheels on frozen ruts. He wiped his hands on a rag and glanced out through the office window. The black and white cruiser was back, cleaner now, but still scarred by years of use. The young officers from 2 nights before climbed out and stood awkwardly in the cold. Hats in their hands, shoulders hunched against the wind. Frank didn't hurry. He finished tightening the last lug nut, lowered the jack, and slid his tool tray back into place. Then he walked out into the bay, movements unhurried, as though this were any other errand. "Runs all right?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the taller one said. His voice had more ease in it now, but there was something like reverence too. "Runs better than it has in months." "Heat works again." Frank nodded once. "Good." The other officer, the younger one with the thin gloves, stepped forward. He held out a folded 20 and a handful of small bills, almost shyly. "We really want to pay you for your time. Parts were already covered, but you were out here half the night. We can't just—" Frank shook his head before the boy could finish. "Keep it, roads long and cold. Buy fuel, buy food, buy better gloves." His gaze fell briefly to the frayed pair in the officer's hand. They hesitated, looked at each other, then tucked the money back, uncomfortable but grateful. The taller one cleared his throat. "We told the watch sergeant what you did. He said to thank you properly." Frank only shrugged. "Nothing to thank. You were stuck. I fixed stuck things." But the two didn't leave. They lingered just inside the big bay door, glancing around the shop, the tidy benches, the old army photograph, the stove ticking quietly in the corner. It was as if they wanted to understand the man who had helped them. After a moment, the younger one asked, "You served, sir?" Frank's eyes flicked to the photograph on the wall, but he didn't turn his head. "A long time ago. Motor pool." Frank allowed himself a faint smile. "Something like that." They didn't press. The question hung a moment, then faded into the low hum of the stove. The taller officer nodded once. A soldier's small salute, though he'd never worn those stripes. "We appreciate it," he said quietly. Cliff looked at them. 2 kids running the same endless roads he once knew, just under a different flag, and for different reasons. He felt a small warmth behind his ribs that he did not name. "Be careful out there," he said. And it was both instruction and blessing. They smiled then, brief and real, before heading back to the cruiser. Doors slammed, the engine turned, healthy and smooth now. As they backed out, the taller one leaned out the window and called, "Thanks again, Mr. Harlan." Frank raised a hand in answer, but said nothing. He watched them drive away until the blue and white faded down the road. Then he turned back inside, closed the bay door, and returned to the day's work. On the counter, his ledger lay open. Under the line for PD Unit 432, he added one small note in the margin. "Returned, running fine." It wasn't necessary. But something about the visit felt worth recording. The kind of detail a man might want to remember when the shop grew quiet again. Outside, the highway stretched silent and cold. Frank poured himself fresh coffee, glanced once at the old army photo, and went back to work. He didn't know and couldn't guess that this brief exchange, these quiet thanks offered and refused, were already moving beyond this garage, passing from one officer to another like an unfinished message. What began as a small kindness had found its own road, and it was still traveling, long after the cruiser's taillights had vanished down the winter highway. The garage returned to its steady rhythm. Frank replaced his rag on the hook near the bench, poured the last of the coffee into his cup, and sat at the small counter by the office window. Outside, dusk pressed in early, sky the color of gunmetal, and the first shy flakes of snow swirled across the lot. He opened the big ledger and looked at the clean black lines of the last entry. PD Unit 432, water pump, belt, hoses, ATF labor, no charge, returned, running fine. The column for cost remained half empty. Only the numbers for parts sat there. Normally, he would total things neatly, add tax, and tear out a slip for the customer. Tonight he only stared at the blank space where a labor figure should be. The department had an account with other garages in town. He knew that. He could have called, billed them, waited for a check. He didn't. He thought of the thin gloves again, the way those two kids had looked, standing uncertain at his door. He had once stood in weather worse than this, and prayed for someone to stop, to help. It wasn't charity. It was recognition. Frank reached for the carbon copy pad that usually accompanied each job. He slid one sheet free and considered filling it out. Habit tugged at him. Date, job description, labor hours, total. But the impulse didn't hold. Instead, he folded the blank form and tucked it back under the counter. Some work didn't need an invoice. Outside, a single car passed on the highway, tires whispering on frozen pavement. The sound faded quickly into the dark. Frank closed the ledger with a deliberate motion and set his coffee aside. The small act felt larger than it should have. As if by refusing payment, he had stepped slightly outside the normal exchange of parts and labor that defined his days. He cleaned the base slowly, pushing the broom across concrete stained by years of oil and salt. Each sweep echoed in the quiet space. He checked locks, banked the stove low, and hung his coveralls on the hook by the door. Then he sat for a while in the wooden chair he kept by the workbench, hands folded, eyes on the tools lined in their bright red chest. The garage had always been his refuge. Work in, work out, problem solved, engine running. A closed loop, but tonight there was a faint sense of something open-ended, as if the favor hadn't ended when the cruiser rolled away. He didn't understand why he felt that, and he didn't examine it. Across town, unknown to him, the story was already moving. The two young officers had arrived back at their station, still warm from the car's fixed heater. They had gone straight to the watch sergeant, laughing with the relief that follows danger safely past. They spoke of the quiet man at the edge of town, how he'd refused their money and worked alone in the cold. The sergeant had listened, eyebrows up. He knew the name Harlan, retired master sergeant, mechanic with a record of decades. He'd seen it once in a veterans event roster, but hadn't connected it to the small shop. That him? He asked. They nodded. The sergeant said nothing more, but jotted something on a scrap of paper. An idea-forming dot in the garage. Frank finally rose, turned off the last light, and stepped outside. The night was absolute. Wind sharp, stars hidden. His boots crunched over snow crust as he walked to his truck. Before climbing in, he looked back once. The bay door gleamed faintly under the security lamp. For a moment he thought he saw the shape of the cruiser there again, steam curling into cold air. He shook his head and climbed in, started the old Ford, and let the heater fight the cold. As he drove toward the dark line of town lights, he did not know that his blank paperwork, just a line in a ledger, would become the spark for something waiting to return to him. Small actions have long shadows, though the man who makes them rarely sees how far they reach. Morning came quietly, the way it always did. Frost filmed the windows of the garage in pale lace, and the gravel out front crunched like glass under Frank's boots. He slipped inside, set his coffee on the counter, and moved through the familiar motions. Switch on the shop lights. Open the big bay door, just enough to let in the winter air. Coax the stove to life until its first pops of heat cracked against the silence. On the workbench sat the ledger, right where he'd left it. Its weight was reassuring. It contained years of his life in ink and paper. Before turning to new jobs, he opened it to the last page and ran a finger down the crisp, black lettering. PD unit, 432 parts only. Returned, running fine. The empty labor column drew his eye again, but this morning there was no debate. He'd made his choice. The page stood as it should. Frank sharpened a pencil and moved on to new work. Two vehicles waited outside, Jake Morgan's diesel and a farm truck needing brakes. The shop returned to its rhythms. Air compressor cycling on, the clank of sockets, the hiss of a creeper rolling under axles. He liked these hours, mechanical and predictable. Yet the previous night's visit wouldn't fade completely. While he drained Jake's oil, the memory slipped in uninvited. The young officers standing there with money they couldn't spare. The way they'd looked at the photograph on his wall without prying. He'd been invisible to most people for years. He preferred it that way. But their eyes had carried something different. By mid-morning, the phone rang a rarity. Frank wiped his hands and answered with a short Harlan's. A voice he didn't know asked about truck tires. Then, about whether he was open Saturday. Ordinary business. Still, he felt a strange awareness behind the call, like a ripple he couldn't see. He told himself he was imagining things. Lunch came and went. Soup heated on the stove. Eaten standing while the compressor cooled. Snow began again, light and dry, feathering the shop's threshold. Frank refilled coffee, then paused, staring across the bay at the spot where the police cruiser had sat. The echo of its presence remained as if some trace of last night's cold and quiet thanks lingered at the station across town. Meanwhile, the small story had spread further. The watch sergeant, a man named Keller, had mentioned a repair during shift change. Harlan out on Route 12, he told the day shift, wouldn't take a dime. Got Unit 432 back on the road. Someone looked up from paperwork and said, Harlan, that's Master Sergeant Harlan, the one from the old convoy maintenance company. Keller shrugged but nodded. By afternoon, Frank had settled back into routine. He finished Jake's diesel, signed the carbon pad with steady strokes, and filed the copy in his drawer. He moved to the farm truck, brakes squealing as he lifted it on the hoist. Underneath, bolts cracked free with the easy groan of old metal. The world shrank again to work and order, the exactness he'd built to keep chaos at bay. But small intrusions kept coming. A sheriff's deputy he didn't know drove by slowly, giving a quick nod before accelerating away. The mail carrier lingered an extra beat when dropping off parts catalogs. Each gesture felt almost accidental, yet not. Frank ignored it all. He trusted the comfort of his shop, the privacy earned by years of service and then silence. Still, when he closed up that evening, he wrote one more line beneath the PD entry, just 3 spare words. Quiet visit logged. It wasn't his usual style to note such things, but something told him to mark the moment. The ledger, closed with a soft thud, held the day's shape. He banked the stove, flipped lights, and locked up. Outside, snow drifted over fresh tire tracks, maybe from the curious deputy, maybe from no one at all. Frank drove home under a sky bruised purple by dusk, unaware that his small shop had just stepped onto the edges of another story. Somewhere downtown, officers gathered quietly in the squad room, speaking his name, looking up records, and deciding on something that would leave him shaking before the month was out. But tonight, Frank only knew the comfort of work done well and the quiet ledger that told the truth of his days. It was the kind of small story that travels without effort. 2 officers relieved from a long night, thawed by the heater of their newly repaired cruiser, had told it over coffee at the end of shift. No embellishment, just facts. Engine failing on the highway. An old man alone in a shop, patient and precise in the cold, refusing money. The watch sergeant had repeated it later in the day room, shaking his head with quiet admiration. By the following afternoon, the tale had reached the desk of Captain Marquez, who oversaw fleet maintenance but rarely thought about the men behind wrenches outside official contracts. Marquez looked up from paperwork when Keller, the sergeant, stuck his head into the office. That old vet on Route 12 saved Unit 432, Keller said. Wouldn't take a cent. Figured you'd want to know. Name? Marquez asked, though he suspected he already knew. Harlan. Frank Harlan. Marquez sat back, fingers steepled. The name tugged at memory. Convoy reports. An army commendation decades old. A training manual footnote about field repairs in hostile zones. He had served after Harlan's time, but knew the reputation. A mechanic who could keep anything running under fire. Keller asked. Legend, Marquez said simply, surprising himself with the word. Meanwhile, Frank had no idea any of this was happening. His world stayed small, filled with winter chores. He rose before sunrise, swept snow, brewed coffee, and set to work on the vehicles that trickled in, a rattling grain hauler. A school bus with dead brake lights. Jake Morgan, back for glow plugs. Each job earned a neat black line in the ledger. Morgan, plugs replaced. School district lights rewired. Yet subtle shifts touched the edges of his quiet life. Another cruiser drove past one morning, slowing enough for the passenger to glance at the sign above his door. Later, a deputy came by on the pretense of asking about tire chains. Frank answered, polite but brief, and the deputy left with a grin that didn't seem tied to tires at all. He shrugged it off. Police were curious by nature. Maybe news of a free repair spread faster than he thought. Still, he found himself thinking of the young officers more often than he meant to, their wary posture melting into relief. The small gratitude in their eyes at the station. Marquez called an informal meeting in the motorpool bay. Several officers gathered, boots wet with melted snow, breath steaming in the cold air. He held up a printed page, yellowed photo clipped to it. Frank in uniform beside an armored truck. Much younger, but unmistakable. This man kept convoys alive before half of you were born, Marquez said. He's patched more bullet holes and blown seals than any manual will teach. And last week he kept one of ours from freezing on Route 12. There were quiet nods, some murmurs. One officer suggested sending a thank you card. Another said, "We can do better than a card." They spoke of what might matter. Not cash, not charity. Respect, recognition. Something that said, "We see you." They started asking questions. Who had contact for veteran records? Who could find old unit insignia? Someone promised to check surplus for a proper display case. Someone else said the chief would sign off on a formal citation, if they wrote it. The mood turned from casual gratitude to a quiet, purposeful mission. Frank, meanwhile, worked another long day, unaware that his name was passing from mouth to mouth downtown. He closed the shop near dusk, boots crunching over ice, ledger updated and stove banked low. The night sky was clear for the first time in days. Stars sharp as nails. He stood a moment, looking upward, breath curling white, then drove home slow along the dark two-lane road. Back at the station, plans had solidified. A small team would gather on their next day off. They would return to the man on Route 12, not with a bill or a handshake, but with something better. Proof that his unseen service, past and present, had not gone unnoticed. The idea carried quiet weight, each person adding to it, a flag, a patch, a citation. Photographs dug up from old archives. Frank slept that night in his small house behind the garage, unaware. For him the week was like any other, framed by the workbench, the ledger, the hiss of the stove. But beyond his door, gratitude was taking shape, deliberate and unstoppable. Carried on voices that refused to let the story end where it began. The first hint reached Frank in the smallest way. Late in the week, while he was under the hood of an aging Buick, a police cruiser slowed on the highway, rolled nearly to a stop, then continued on without turning in. He glanced up only briefly, black and white, windows dark from glare, then bent back to the manifold bolts. Cars paused sometimes to check directions or sell coverage. He didn't think much of it, but it happened again the next morning. Different cruiser, different unit number. This one idled a moment by the mailbox before pulling away. Frank's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Inside the station house miles away, curiosity had turned to quiet action. The story of the old vet out on Route 12 had now passed through nearly every patrol shift. Someone in admin dug out a personnel file from state archives. Others made calls. Supply sergeant at the guard armory, clerk at the county veterans office, even a retired captain who remembered Harlan from the European motor pool. Each call returned, small fragments, campaign ribbons earned, commendations filed and forgotten. Photographs where a younger Frank stood grinning with grease-black hands, beside machines meant for war. The information traveled quietly, stitched together by officers who understood that respect didn't need ceremony, only care. They found details Frank had never shared, that he'd kept supply convoys moving across frozen Ardennes roads, that a field commendation credited his quick repair of a half-track for saving an entire platoon pinned under fire. They passed a printed copy of that report around the break room, silent for a moment after reading it. Back at the garage, the days fell back into routine. Frank fixed brakes, patched radiator hoses, replaced a clutched master cylinder for a delivery van. He didn't know that each car passing slowly on the road was someone confirming the way, noting the shape of the shop, planning a return. One afternoon, Jake Morgan came by for coffee and air in his tires. "Lot of cruisers on the highway lately," Jake said casually, watching Frank refill the compressor. Frank shrugged. "Guess they've got reason." Jake gave him a searching look but dropped the subject. Everyone in town knew not to pry too far into Frank's quiet. Still, Frank felt an odd hum beneath the normal day. When he wrote new entries in the ledger that night, Morgan diesel glow plugs done. His eye wandered to the earlier line about PD Unit 432. He traced the letters once with a finger, then closed the book firmly. At the police department, momentum grew. Officers pooled small funds. One of them drove to towns over to a military surplus store, hunting for the right wooden presentation case. Another contacted a local veteran who still embroidered unit patches. A young patrolman volunteered to scan and print old photos in crisp black and white. Captain Marquez wrote and rewrote the citation until the words felt true but not grandiose. A simple acknowledgement of service, skill, and quiet generosity. Chief O'Connor signed the final draft late one evening, leaning back in his chair after reading it twice. "Make sure we do this right," he told Marquez. "No parade, no fuss, just respect." Snow fell hard that night, blanketing the back roads, but inside the motor pool bay officers worked after shift, fitting the photos into the shadow box, aligning ribbons and insignia, pressing the glass snug. They were careful not to damage anything, careful that it looked like it belonged in the hands of the man they'd come to admire. From a distance, Frank, meanwhile, tended his stove, and read a tattered service manual before bed. Glasses perched low on his nose. He didn't hear the far-off hum of cruisers passing, didn't see the plan coalescing across town. To him, life was still simple, one machine at a time, one honest line in the book. But the space between his quiet world and theirs was closing, unseen. In a few days, curiosity would become presence, headlights again on the gravel. But this time more than one pair, and no broken engine to explain them. Something else entirely was on its way, carried by respect that had grown stronger with each passing story, and each quiet look from a patrol car window. The next Monday arrived brittle and cold. Sky pale as unpolished steel. Frank's shop warmed slowly, stove ticking and groaning as it forced heat into the big concrete room. He worked alone on a grain hauler's axle seals, sleeves rolled to the elbow, breath still fogging despite the fire. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that settled deep into muscle memory, until the hum of tires began again. Not one car this time, several. He caught the sound before he saw the lights. A low convoy noise you don't forget once you've lived on convoys. Frank straightened and wiped his hands, eyes narrowing toward the road. First came a single black and white cruiser, then another behind it, and another. They moved slow and deliberate, turning into his gravel lot with a crunch that set every dog in the distance barking. Snow puffed under tires. Exhaust hung in the brittle air. Frank counted 4 units before they stopped, noses angled neatly toward the bay door. He stood still, rag in hand. Patrol cars didn't travel in groups without reason. His first thought, something bad had happened. They needed help, or worse, bad news was coming. The old reflex flared. Check exits, measure distance, keep calm. But these cars didn't park in a hurry. Engines idled steady, doors stayed shut at first. Finally one opened. The young officer from the first night, thinner gloves now replaced with proper winter gear, stepped out and looked his way. Behind him, the taller partner emerged, followed by others Frank didn't know. A sergeant, stripes bright on his sleeve, came last, scanning the yard before his gaze settled on Frank. Frank hung the rag on a hook, smoothed his shirt unconsciously, and stepped to the bay door. "Morning," he said, voice flat but not unfriendly. "Morning, Mr. Harlan," the young one answered. His tone was careful but warm. "We're sorry to drop in on you unannounced." Frank glanced at the line of cars. "Looks like more than sorry," he said quietly. The sergeant came forward then, boots grinding over the frozen gravel. He removed his hat and held it against his chest, a gesture that softened the cold space between them. "Sir, we're not here for trouble. We came to see you." "See me?" Frank asked, frown deepening. "Yes, sir," the sergeant said simply. Doors opened now. Officers climbed out, forming an easy but deliberate half-circle near the entrance. They weren't armed for confrontation, sidearms holstered, hands free, but the formality was unmistakable. Frank's stomach tightened. Attention of any kind was something he had spent years avoiding. The taller officer from that first night stepped up beside the sergeant. "We wanted to thank you," he said, voice clearer now, stronger than when his radiator had been steaming. "Not just for the other night, for everything." Frank shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "I just fixed a car." A quiet ripple of smiles passed among the officers, not mocking but knowing. The sergeant shook his head. "No, sir, you've done a lot more than that. We found out who you are. What you did, thought it was time someone said it out loud." Frank's mouth opened, then shut. His first instinct was to wave them off, tell them the past was past. But the sight before him, half the department standing respectful in his frozen yard, stopped him. He had faced down worse odds in colder mornings, but not this kind of gathering. One of the cruisers cut its engine. The others followed, leaving a sudden, deep quiet broken only by the wind. In that silence Frank felt the old soldier in him stir, not the fighter, but the man who had led convoys through ambush and ice, and never asked for thanks. "Whatever this is," he said at last, voice slower, "you didn't need to come all this way." "We did," the sergeant answered. And as the words settled in the cold air, Frank realized this was no accident, no passing curiosity. Something was about to unfold here in his yard, something shaped by stories he hadn't told, and gratitude he hadn't asked for. He stood still, hands rough and stained, while the line of officers formed tighter, and the youngest among them stepped forward carrying a long, narrow case wrapped in a dark wool blanket. Frank stayed where he was, one hand hooked on the bay door rail, watching the line of patrol cars settle silent in the cold. Exhaust drifted white behind idling tailpipes, until one by one the engines cut off, and the quiet grew heavy. The young officer he first met, the one whose hands had been raw from cold, The knight stepped closer now, with a respectful caution. The wool-wrapped case balanced in his arms. The taller partner was beside him, face set but gentle, and behind them more uniforms fanned slightly, not in rank, but in quiet support. A few nodded to Frank. Most just held his gaze a moment, then looked to the sergeant, as if waiting for a cue. It was the sergeant who broke the stillness. "Mr. Harlan," he said, voice level but carrying. "We know you didn't want payment. We know you've spent years out here just doing your work. But we couldn't let the other night pass without doing something right." Frank's brow tightened. "Didn't ask for anything," he said softly. "That's why we're here," the sergeant answered. A deputy stepped from the last cruiser, carrying a small wooden crate, and set it on the gravel. Another brought a folded flag in a clear case. The group shifted closer, as if forming a quiet perimeter of respect rather than pressure. Frank's instinct was to step back, retreat to the safety of his garage, but something kept him still. Maybe it was the memory of those two kids stranded in the cold, or maybe the recognition that he wasn't being cornered, he was being seen. The sergeant cleared his throat once more and turned to the young officer with the wool-wrapped case. "Go on." The young man nodded and approached. His boots crunched softly, breath puffing in the frosted air. He stopped just a few feet from Frank and lowered his eyes briefly before speaking. "Sir, we told the story of that night. It didn't stay just a story. People looked you up. People who know what your name means." Frank shifted uneasily, but said nothing. "We wanted to thank you the way soldiers thank each other," the young man continued. He lifted the bundle and peeled the blanket back with deliberate care. A polished wooden case emerged, brass latches catching what little winter light filtered through the clouds. He turned it so Frank could see. Inside, velvet cradled a patch and badge unlike any issued for duty. The town's police insignia worked in thread and metal. Beneath it, a plaque engraved simply, "To Master Sergeant Frank Harlan, mechanic, mentor, quiet guardian, for keeping us moving, then and now." Behind the young man, the sergeant spoke again, quieter now. "You served before any of us put on a uniform. You kept convoys alive when it mattered most. And last week, you kept ours alive too. We don't forget things like that." Frank's hands, oil-stained and trembling slightly, stayed at his sides. He stared at the case, but didn't reach for it. Memories flickered unbidden. Headlights in blizzard dark. The taste of cordite and diesel. The desperate push to keep engines running so others could survive. He had buried all that in work and silence. Seeing it honored now cracked something open. The taller officer stepped forward with the flag case. "This flew over our station last Veterans Day," he said. "We thought it belonged somewhere better." Snow hissed faintly on the wind. Frank swallowed hard. "You didn't have to, we know," the sergeant said gently. "That's why we wanted to." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the distant moan of the wind across the fields. Then Frank reached out, slow and hesitant, and let his rough fingers brush the polished wood. He didn't take the case, not yet, but the touch alone seemed to settle the group. Shoulders eased, breath released. "Come inside," Frank said finally. Voice rough. Relief and warmth broke across the officers' faces. They followed him into the shop in quiet single file, boots knocking off snow at the door. The stove snapped and hissed as they gathered in the wide bay, suddenly turning the cold morning into mid-dot. No one rushed to speak. No speeches came. Just the quiet of men and women standing near another man's workbench. Steam rising from their coats. Respect filling the space more strongly than heat. For the first time in years, the garage didn't feel only his. It felt joined, alive with others who understood something about long roads, cold nights, and keeping each other going. Frank set the case gently on the workbench and looked up at them. Eyes bright but he said nothing more, and none of them needed him to. They crowded in loosely. A half-circle of uniforms edged by the faint smell of wet wool and winter air. The stove's ticking filled the gaps where words would have been. Frank stood at his workbench, the polished wooden case before him, still unopened beyond that first lift of the blanket. The brass latches gleamed against the scarred surface of the bench, reflecting the shop's single overhead light. For a moment he just studied it. Years of habit had taught him to measure and understand things before touching them. Machines, men, circumstances. He traced a calloused thumb across the top, reading the grain of the oak. He felt, rather than saw, the eyes on him. The room was quiet, but not tense. Awaiting quiet. Like soldiers on a line before the next order. Finally, he flipped the latches. They gave a soft snap, sharp in the silence. The lid opened slowly, the scent of oiled wood rising faint and clean. Inside, the objects rested on dark green velvet. At the top, stitched in careful thread, was the police department's crest. but worked differently than the patches Frank had seen. Deeper color, polished edges, weight enough to feel like a medallion rather than cloth. Beneath it lay the engraved plate he'd glimpsed outside. To Master Sergeant Frank Harlan, mechanic, mentor, quiet guardian, for keeping us moving. Then and now, below the plate lay something unexpected. Not just the honorary badge, but a row of small enameled service pins, motor pool insignia, unit number, campaign markers he hadn't seen in decades. Someone had found details only a man's old orders would hold. Frank stared down at them, the room tilting faintly with memory. For a heartbeat, the shop wasn't a shop, but a field tent in cold rain. Engines rumbling alive because he and his crew refused to quit. Men's faces flashed, names long since gone quiet, and a young version of himself working under blackout hoods. Hands numb but steady. The sergeant spoke softly, breaking the moment before it swallowed the room. We asked some people. Folks remembered, thought you deserved to know we know. Frank's throat worked, but no sound came. He nodded once, slow, as if acknowledging not the gift but the fact of being seen. The taller officer, the one who'd first asked for help, cleared his throat. We didn't know who you were that night. We just needed a radiator and a chance to get warm. But after you helped us, we asked, "Sir, you've done more for people like us than we could count." Frank closed the case gently, but left his hand resting on its lid. His other hand braced on the workbench. He looked older and younger at once. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said quietly. "We know," the sergeant replied. "That's why it matters." One of the younger deputies, nervous, stepped forward with a thermos. "We brought coffee, sir. Thought maybe you'd let us sit a minute." A surprised huff of a laugh left Frank before he could stop it. He gestured toward the stove. "Cups are there." They moved in carefully, pulling enamel mugs from a hook, filling them with the steaming black liquid someone had brewed on the drive. The scent filled the shop, richer than the usual bitterness of solo mornings. They drank standing, boots melting small pools of snow on the concrete, talking quietly about patrol routes and winter roads, about the night Unit 432 nearly died out on the flats. No grand speeches, no forced cheer, just men and women sharing a kind of quiet fellowship that required no permission once offered. Frank listened more than he spoke. But some walls shifted inside him. The garage had always been fortress and refuge. Now, just for this morning, it was something softer. When the coffee ran low and silence came back, the sergeant set his mug down. "We'll let you get back to work. But sir, if you ever need us, we're one radio call away. Family doesn't stop at uniforms." Frank nodded slowly, eyes on the closed case. "Appreciate that," he said, voice rough but steady. They filed out one by one, quiet goodbyes, firm nods. Engines turned over, lights flickered, and soon the convoy was gone. Tailpipes steaming into the pale sky. Frank stood alone again in the echoing warmth of the shop. He looked down at the bench where the case sat, and the flag beside it, its blue field deep under clear glass. His hands shook once, just enough that he set them flat to steady himself. Then, slowly, he opened the case again, letting the green velvet catch light. For the first time in a very long time, the old soldier allowed himself a small, private smile. Not pride exactly. Something quieter, heavier, and unexpectedly good. The shop felt changed once the patrol cars were gone. Not louder, not busier, just changed, like the air after a hard storm. Frank stood at the bench for a long while, one palm resting flat on the polished lid of the presentation case. The flag sat nearby, glass catching faint stove light, its blue field deep and still. He wasn't a man given to ceremony. Most of his life had been bolts, grease, road miles, and long silence. Even in the army, recognition usually came as a brief nod from an officer hurrying somewhere else. A typed line on an orders sheet, but the words engraved on the plate had weight. Quiet guardian. It wasn't something he'd ever thought to call himself. When he finally moved, it was slow and deliberate. He cleared a shelf above the bench where an old calendar hung, tacked there for years more out of habit than use. He folded the calendar and set it aside, then placed the case on the bare wood. The badge gleamed faintly as he cracked the lid open again. He traced the lettering with his thumb, the brass warm from the stove's gentle heat. The door creaked and startled him. Jake Morgan leaned in, snow on his shoulders. "Saw a parade of cruisers leaving," Jake said, stepping just inside. "Something happened." Frank hesitated. "They came to say thanks." Jake's eyebrows went up. "That's so. About that radiator job." "Something like that," Frank said quietly. He didn't elaborate. Jake didn't press. They'd known each other long enough to leave space where a man wanted it. Jake just nodded. toward the case. Looks fine. Suits you. Frank gave a small grunt, halfway between agreement and discomfort, and poured 2 cups of coffee. They stood by the stove a while, steam rising, conversation meandering to weather and fuel prices, safe and ordinary. But every so often Jake's eyes went back to the flag and the badge, and his expression softened in a way Frank pretended not to notice. After Jake left, the quiet returned, but it wasn't empty. Frank sat at the desk where his ledger lay open. He flipped through old pages, names of customers, neat black lines of jobs long finished. In the margin near the PD entry, his own earlier notes stared back. Quiet visit logged. He smiled faintly and added one more line below. Officers returned. Brought thanks. The words felt strange under his pencil. He wasn't used to writing about himself, but the act steadied him. Proof that what had happened was real and had touched something deeper than the workbench. That night, alone in his small house behind the garage, Frank found sleep slow to come. The faces of the young officers kept returning. The way they'd stood in his yard, not with demand, but with gratitude so plain it almost hurt to see. He remembered other faces. Men from convoys long ago. Men who hadn't lived long enough to come back and say thanks to anyone. For a moment the weight of all those silent years pressed heavy on him. And then, quietly, it eased. He got up once, pulled on boots, and stepped out into the cold. Stars blazed sharp above the dark highway. From here the world seemed empty. But somewhere out there patrol cars were running smooth and warm, because he'd taken the time. And somewhere downtown, people who wore badges had taken the time for him. Frank stood there until the cold bit through his coat. Before heading back inside, he looked once more at the dark road and let a few quiet words escape, just for himself. Guess we're not forgotten after all. Inside, the shop smelled of oil and oak and faint coffee. On the bench, the flag and the badge waited in the warm glow of the stove. Silent testaments to a life spent keeping others moving. Frank banked the fire, turned off the lights, and let the darkness close gently around him. Different now, somehow softer, because of words he hadn't expected but had finally been spoken. Snow squeaked under boots the next afternoon when Frank heard the knock. He had not expected anyone. The shop was closed for inventory. Just him and the stove and the long ritual of counting bolts, belts, and filters. He wiped his hands on a rag and opened the door. 2 cruisers sat in the lot, engines idling gently. The sergeant from before stepped forward, hat in hand, followed by the taller of the 2 young officers. They looked different without the big group, more personal, almost hesitant. "Afternoon, Mr. Harlan," the sergeant said. "Mind if we come in for a minute?" Frank gave a single nod and stepped aside. They stamped snow from their boots and stood just inside, warming slowly in the air. The taller officer carried a single folder tucked under his arm. Plain manila, corners soft from handling. "Didn't mean to intrude," the sergeant said. "Chief O'Connor wanted something delivered proper. We figured it should be here, where you work." Frank frowned slightly, glanced toward the bench where the case and flags still rested. "Thought we did this already." "We did," the sergeant replied. "But the department thought a formal citation should go with what we brought you." Chief signed it himself. The taller officer opened the folder and unfolded heavy parchment. The kind used for the seal of the department sat embossed in blue and silver at the top. The young man cleared his throat, nerves flickering across his face, before he began to read aloud. "To Master Sergeant Frank Harlan, United States Army, retired," he said, voice steadying as he went, "for extraordinary service rendered to the safety and welfare of this community. On a night of severe winter weather, you provided aid without hesitation to officers of this department, restoring their disabled patrol vehicle and ensuring their safe return. In doing so, you continued a lifetime of selfless maintenance of men and machines under conditions of hardship and risk. Your quiet guardianship, past and present, stands as an example of service beyond duty and payment." He paused, glanced up as if to be sure he should go on. Frank's eyes were down, fixed somewhere on the floor between them. "By order of Chief of Police Daniel O'Connor," the officer continued, "this citation and the accompanying badge are presented with gratitude and respect on behalf of every member of this force." The young man finished and folded the paper carefully. But for a few heartbeats no one spoke. The words hung in the warm air of the shop like smoke. Frank finally looked up. His face gave little away except a faint tremor at the jaw, quickly controlled. "That's a lot for turning a wrench," he said, voice dry but softer than usual. The sergeant shook his head once. "It's a lot for a life spent keeping others safe. Sometimes we don't say things soon enough. We wanted to say them now." Frank didn't answer right away. He reached out slowly and took the parchment when the young man offered it. His hand, broad and oil-marked, swallowed the clean sheet. He read the words again silently, lips moving a little, then set it down beside the presentation case and the flag. "Suppose I appreciate it," he said finally, looking up at them, "though I was fine being quiet." "We know," the sergeant said, "but we're better for knowing you're here." A long pause followed, comfortable in its way. Then Frank gestured toward the pot on the stove. "Coffee's hot." The invitation was enough. They found mugs and poured, and the three of them stood a while by the workbench, sipping and talking about simple things. Road conditions, old patrol cars, a new mechanic at the city yard. Nothing grand. Just the slow weave of ordinary talk that fills the space after important words are spoken. When at last the sergeant and the young officer left, Frank followed them to the door. Outside the sky was going pink with early dusk. The cruiser's idled tailpipes curling white smoke. "Take care out there," he said. "You too." "Sir," they answered together. He watched them go until the lights faded, then stepped back inside. Alone again, he touched the citation once more, not to read but to feel the weight of it. Then he slid it carefully into a clear sleeve and placed it behind the glass of the presentation case. Just above the badge, it looked right there. Among the tools and the photographs, one more honest record in a life built on quiet work. Frank sat for a while on his stool, staring at the case, letting the silence settle back around him. But now the quiet felt different, not empty, but full of voices that had finally spoken what long years had left unsaid. The next morning, light cut low through the shop windows, sharpening every edge of metal and wood. Frank was at his bench early, sorting a box of used alternators for cores, when the door chime rang. Not the sharp clang of a stranger, but a careful sound, like someone who belonged enough to come inside. It was the taller young officer again, alone this time. He had no folder, no ceremony, only a small parcel wrapped in plain brown paper. Snow clung to his boots and the shoulders of his jacket. "Morning, Mr. Harlan," he said. Frank nodded once, put down the alternator, and wiped his hands. "Morning. Roads clear." "Not bad. Department plow's been out." The young man hesitated, then lifted the package. "They asked me to bring this last piece of what we meant to give you." Frank frowned faintly but gestured toward the bench. The officer laid the parcel down with almost reverent care. He didn't open it himself, only stepped back and waited. Frank eyed it for a moment, then reached for his knife, the same small blade he'd used for decades to cut hoses and gaskets. The paper peeled back with crisp sounds, revealing a heavy black leather wallet, not for money but for identity. Inside, set against dark felt, rested the department's official maintenance patch and an honorary identification card embossed with his name. Frank Harlan, Master Sergeant Rhett, Honorary Motor Pool. He turned the wallet in his hands. The leather was new, but smelled faintly of machine oil. Someone had chosen it carefully. The patch's threads gleamed in subdued gold and deep blue, and the card, simple, official, no frills, felt heavier than its weight. "Means you've got a standing invite," the young man said quietly. "Motor pool, station, anywhere you might need. They said it's so if you ever want to stop by, help out, or just check in. You don't have to ask." Frank looked up slowly, suspicion softened by surprise. "I don't need special permission to visit a garage." "No, sir," the officer agreed, "but it's a way of saying you're one of us if you want to be." That landed somewhere deep. Frank glanced at the photograph on the wall. His old crew, decades younger, then back to the patch and badge. He'd walked away from uniforms long ago, from orders and units and belonging. And yet here was an open door, offered without demand. He shut the wallet gently and set it beside the presentation case. "Tell them I appreciate it," he said. The young man's face eased into a genuine smile. "We figured you wouldn't want speeches. Just thought it mattered." Frank nodded. "It does." They shared coffee, standing by the stove, as outside the wind scraped across the empty fields. The young officer asked about trucks, about cold weather tricks for keeping engines alive on patrol. Frank found himself answering more than usual. Which coolant brands held better in how to listen for a failing bearing before it seizes. When the coffee was gone, the young man put on his gloves and hat again. "Thanks for the time, sir." Frank grunted softly. "Drive safe." After the cruiser pulled away, silence filled the shop again, but it was a warmer silence. Frank looked at the wallet and the card, ran his thumb once over the patch. He had expected nothing after that night's repair. He'd spent decades unnoticed, and he'd told himself he liked it that way. Yet the simple object in his hand, no fanfare, just invitation, felt like a bridge between the solitary life he'd built and the world he'd once known. He placed the wallet, in the top drawer of his bench where his best tools lived, a place of honor he rarely gave to anything not made of steel. Then he picked up his rag, returned to the alternators, and let the day roll back into work. But the shop's air held a new note, subtle but present, that somewhere beyond these walls, he belonged again if he chose to. 2 days later, the sound of tires on gravel returned once more, softer this time. Only one cruiser. Frank looked up from a carburetor rebuild and found the sergeant standing outside. Coat zipped high, breath rising in white threads. He carried nothing official looking, no clipboard or folder, just a flat cardboard box tucked under one arm, wrapped in plain brown and tied with jute string. Frank swung the bay door up halfway, enough for the man to step inside out of the wind. "You're getting to be a regular," Frank said, voice dry but not unfriendly. The sergeant smiled a little. "Hope it's not unwelcome." Frank wiped his hands. "Depends what you're selling." "Not selling, delivering. Last piece of unfinished business." The sergeant set the box on the workbench with a care that told Frank whatever it was mattered. Frank's brow furrowed as he cut the string and lifted the lid. Inside lay a shallow wooden frame, not glossy like the presentation case, but handmade, warm pine edges sanded smooth, glass front clear and clean. Beneath the glass was a collage of photographs and service artifacts, a yellowed convoy pass with his name, a black and white picture of a young Frank crouched under an engine hood, a small scrap of an old unit flag with faded stitching. Someone had gone digging far deeper than he'd realized. At the center of the arrangement was a single photo he hadn't seen in decades. Himself and 3 other mechanics, in soaked fatigues, beside a hop. One man raising a wrench like a toast, all of them laughing despite rain and mud. Frank's throat tightened hard and sudden. "Where'd you find these?" His voice came rough, low. "Veterans Office helped," the sergeant said quietly. "Some came from the archives at Fort Drum. Couple were floating around in a reunion newsletter. We pulled what we could and put it together. Thought maybe you'd want to see who you were, who you still are." Frank didn't answer right away. He sat on the stool, glasses sliding low on his nose as he leaned closer to the glass. His finger hovered but didn't touch. He studied each image, each line of faded text, lips moving slightly, as if greeting old ghosts by name. The sergeant stayed silent, hat in his hands. The only sound was the stove's low tick and the winter wind beyond the bay. Finally, Frank spoke, still staring at the frame. "Most of them gone now. I figured," the sergeant said, "but not forgotten." Frank exhaled slowly, the sound long and uneven. "Didn't think anyone care about this stuff anymore." "We care," the sergeant said simply, "because the way you lived, still live, matters to us. You didn't just fix a car that night. You reminded my guys what it means to serve quiet and sure. That's worth remembering." Frank's jaw worked. He swallowed and nodded once, sharp and brief. "Appreciate it." They didn't push more words. The sergeant helped hang the frame high on the main wall, above the bench where Frank's best wrenches gleamed. Together they stepped back. The photographs looked at home there, not dusty relics, but living memory pressed into glass. When the sergeant turned to go, Frank said, "Coffee." The man hesitated, then smiled. 1 cup they drank, standing. No small talk this time. Just the quiet presence of 2 men who understood what service cost and gave. When the cup was empty, the sergeant pulled on his gloves. "You know we'll keep an eye out," he said at the door. "I know," Frank answered. After the cruiser left, Frank locked up and stood alone in the middle of the bay. Sunlight through the high window caught the new frame and made the old convoy photo glow faint and golden. For a long moment he simply looked, breath slow, hands loose at his sides. He had built his life to be small and unnoticed. Yet here, nailed into his own wall, was proof that what he had done, and what he still quietly did, had found its way back. The cold outside felt less sharp as he stoked the stove, poured himself coffee, and sat under the watch of his younger self, laughing in the rain. That evening, the shop was dark except for the glow of the stove and a small desk lamp, aimed at the new frame. Frank sat alone on his stool, coffee cooling in his hand, unable to stop looking at it. Hours had passed since the sergeant left, but the photographs seemed alive, pieces of a life he had packed away like old gear and never meant to unpack. The faces looked impossibly young. There was Curtis, who could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded and once traded his watch for spark plugs from a Belgian farmer. There was Leon, who whistled jazz standards through his teeth no matter how bad the road got. And there he was, Frank himself, grin wide, hair dark, eyes that hadn't yet seen too many winters. He remembered the smell of wet canvas and diesel, the clatter of tracks on ice, the thin coffee boiled over open flames. He remembered the long nights when silence wasn't peace but danger. The quick repairs by feel alone. The weight of men's lives resting on whether a half-track would start in the next 10 seconds. For years, he had locked those things away. It wasn't shame. It was survival. Coming home had meant choosing quiet and work. Things you could control with your own 2 hands. But now, with those images on the wall, and the flag and badge below, memory came back, like thawing earth, slow at first. Then, deep and unstoppable. Frank set his mug down, and reached for the old ledger, flipping past recent pages to the earliest ones. The first months after he'd opened the shop. The handwriting there was younger, but already neat. The first farm truck. The first diesel hauler. The first job done for no charge because someone needed to get home. Beneath the columns he'd sometimes scribbled notes. Reminded me of Convoy 14. Or Field Fix. Easy. He'd forgotten he used to write those. He found himself smiling at the lines. The work had never really changed. It was just quieter now. He had still been keeping people moving. Only under different skies. The wind pushed against the bay door, rattling it softly, and Frank looked up. On the bench, the leather wallet and the honorary patch waited, as if patient for him to decide what they meant. Beyond them, the photographs stared back. That laughing group in the rain. A single captured second of youth and grit. Frank stood and crossed to the wall. Up close, the glass fogged slightly with his breath. "You'd laugh at this, boys," he murmured, voice catching but warm. Whole police department making a fuss. He traced one gloved finger lightly along the frame, touching no picture long but giving each a moment. Then he stepped back, squared his shoulders, and let out a long breath that seemed to leave space behind it. The next morning he rose, early as always, but felt a subtle shift in the weight he carried. The shop looked the same but didn't feel lonely. He brewed coffee and left a second cup warming on the stove. An old habit from convoy days, when you always brewed for one more, just in case. Later, while changing tires for a neighbor, he caught himself humming low under his breath. Some half-remembered tune from those years overseas. It surprised him, but it didn't hurt. Memory had come back, not as burden, but as something restored. The gifts, the case, the flag, the patch, the photographs hadn't trapped him in the past. They'd given him permission to hold it again without fear. When the job was done, Frank added a note in the ledger's margin beside the PD entry. "Old roads remembered." Then he shut the book with care and looked once more at the wall. The faces there didn't feel like ghosts anymore. They felt like company. And for the first time in many winters, Frank realized the long silence he had built for himself could hold other voices too. Voices of gratitude, of memory, of roads still connecting back to him. By the end of the week, the shop no longer felt like only a workplace. People had begun stopping by. Not crowds, not noise, just a slow, respectful trickle. The first was Jake again, pulling up with a thermos and a quiet grin. He came to check a squeak in his truck, but spent more time standing in front of the new frame on the wall, hat in his hands. He didn't ask about the men in the photos, but he looked long and deep. And when he left, he patted Frank's shoulder once, without words. Then came the mail carrier, a woman Frank barely knew beyond parts deliveries. She brought a padded envelope and lingered, eyes drawn to the flag and badge on the bench. "Didn't know you were Army," she said softly. "My dad was, too." Frank nodded, said little, but offered coffee. She stayed a while, telling one story about her father's truck breaking down on convoy. When she left, she smiled in a way that seemed to change her day. Word spread, though Frank hadn't told anyone. The story slipped into the quiet channels of a small town. The mechanic who helped the police. The visit. The ceremony. The highway brought more slow-rolling cruisers, sometimes pausing just long enough to tip a hat or flash a quick salute from behind the windshield. Frank didn't chase them off. Something in him had softened. Where once he might have retreated, now he simply let it happen. He kept the shop running as always. Oil changes, winter tires, starter motors, swapped out in the cold. But he also kept the stove hotter. And he left that second mug by the pot every morning, just in case someone came. One afternoon, two of the young officers from earlier, not the pair he'd rescued but others, from the department, stopped in for chains and coffee. They were awkward at first, then easy once Frank spoke a little about proper tension on cables. One noticed the convoy photo and asked who the men were. Frank surprised himself by answering, naming each quietly. They listened, respectful, not prying for drama, just hearing him. That night, Frank sat alone after closing and looked at the wall. The gifts, the photographs, the flag, they had transformed the space. His father's old saying came to mind. A shop is a kind of church, if you keep it honest. Frank had never thought of it that way until now. But under that quiet roof, with wrenches shining and memories hanging clear. It felt true. He found himself taking small steps he never would have imagined a month ago. He dug out an old footlocker from the storage room, one he hadn't opened since discharge. Inside were patches, a battered field manual, and letters from men long gone. He cleaned and sorted them, added a few to the wall beside the new frame. It wasn't decoration. It was a truthful ledger, the same way he kept for his work. People noticed. Jake brought an old photo of Frank working on his first tractor and tacked it to the edge of the frame. The mail carrier left a note. "Thank you for keeping the roads safe then and now." Officers who stopped for coffee sometimes added small tokens, a patch, a challenge coin, a signed photo of Unit 432, safe and smiling. Frank didn't seek any of it, but he didn't refuse it either. Slowly, the shop became something more than a garage. It was still his refuge, but now it was also a quiet memorial, a place where service lived on in bolts and steel and memory. At day's end, as he swept the concrete floor, Frank felt a calm he hadn't known since before he came home long ago. The world was still hard and winter still bitter, but here, in this small building on the edge of town, his life's long road and the people he'd once served were no longer lost to silence. They had found their way back, and in their return, they'd left a warmth that surprised him every time he looked at the wall. The next morning broke clear and painfully cold, the kind of cold that makes metal ring sharp and glass sing under your knuckles. Frank unlocked the shop as he always did, sweeping aside a light fall of powder snow. The place looked the same, stove ticking, tools lined neat, but the air felt changed in ways he couldn't name. He made his coffee, poured the second mug as he had started to do, and walked the shop floor while the bay door groaned upward. Light spilled across the bench and caught on the new memorial wall. For a moment he just stood there, coffee in hand, letting his eyes trace the arc of his life now nailed into place. Convoy photographs, unit patch, department badge, flag folded under glass. It was quiet, but not empty quiet. Jobs arrived as usual. Jake swung by to pick up the tractor he'd left overnight. Another farmer came with a plow truck, whose hydraulic line had split in the freeze. A delivery van limped in before lunch. Frank worked each job methodically, same as always. But every time he paused for parts, or a sip of coffee, his eyes drifted to the wall. Instead of the old ache of remembering, there was a new steadiness, an odd, almost reluctant comfort. Midday brought a small, unexpected moment. A lone cruiser eased into the lot. Not the young officers this time, but a deputy Frank didn't know well. The man came in, hat low, and asked about a slow battery drain on his unit. They talked shop a few minutes. Frank suggested an alternator test and a new ground strap. When the man left, he shook Frank's hand firmly and said, "Thanks for what you did, for them and for us." Then he was gone. Snow dust lifting behind his tires. Frank stood for a while, after the door closed. "For them and for us." The words echoed quietly in the rafters. He'd spent decades keeping the past separate from the present. But now, without asking permission, the two had met, and it was fine. As dusk fell, he sat at the small desk by the stove and opened the ledger. He turned past pages of routine work until he reached the most recent entries. The line about PD Unit 432, the marginal note about the visit, the later scrawl old roads remembered. On an empty page he began a new entry, slower than usual. Today, quiet thanks, continued. New faces, same road. He didn't plan to show it to anyone. It was simply his way of keeping truth. For years the ledger had measured work done, parts fitted, vehicles saved. Now it measured something else too. Connection. Night came early. Frank shut down the compressor, banked the stove, and locked the bay. Before heading to the house, he lingered a long moment at the wall. He touched the glass of the frame with 2 fingers, a small, almost unconscious salute. Inside the house, he fixed a simple supper, washed up, and sat by the window, watching highway lights drift by. The road was the same lonely strip it had always been, but he no longer felt entirely apart from it. Somewhere out there were men and women driving warm because he'd kept them moving. Somewhere downtown were people who'd looked him up and remembered his name. It wasn't pride. Frank still didn't care for the word. It was something quieter, a rightness that let him breathe deeper. He didn't need crowds or speeches, just to know the work of his hands had reached beyond the shop and touched lives in ways he hadn't dared imagine. Before bed, he checked the stove once more, then returned to the wall. The wallet with the badge sat in the drawer, but he took it out and set it on the bench, deciding to keep it where he could see it. A small reminder that if he ever stepped beyond these walls, there were people ready to meet him halfway. Then he switched off the lights, leaving the memorial bathed in the soft orange of the stove. In the darkness, Frank felt the quiet settle back, familiar, but no longer lonely. He was still himself, a man with oil-stained hands and a careful ledger. But now, beyond the solitary rhythm of engines and repairs, a quiet thread connected him to others. And that thread, he realized, was strong enough to hold through any winter. Winter held on for weeks, but the rhythm at Harlan's auto never faltered. Frank opened the bay door each dawn, swept snow from the stoop, lit the stove, and wrote neat black letters in his ledger. But the shop's edges had softened. The space no longer felt sealed from the world. The memorial wall had become a quiet magnet. Officers came through now and then, not often enough to crowd, just enough to keep a thread alive. Sometimes it was an alternator check, sometimes a tire patch. They never came empty-handed. A bag of coffee beans from the break room, a new shop rag stitched with a department crest, a photograph of Unit 432 taped carefully near the convoy picture. Frank always grumbled, but he let each token stay. Locals followed suit. Jake dropped off a hand-painted sign, Harlan's auto, keeping the road alive since 1975, and insisted on hanging it above the bench. The mail carrier left a small wooden bench out front one Saturday, sanded and varnished, a gift from her and her brothers. She left no note, but Frank understood. It was a place for waiting, for talking, and people began to use it. At first, it was an older farmer waiting for a tire plug, stamping his boots and staring at the convoy photos through the open door. Then two officers on break, sipping coffee and swapping road stories under the low winter sun. One morning Frank came out to find a small cluster, a deputy, Jake, the mail carrier, even the kid from the grain cop sitting shoulder to shoulder, talking quietly. When they noticed him, they only nodded, scooted down to make space. Frank surprised himself by sitting, just for a minute. The bench became a fixture after that. Some days it sat empty, snow dusting its slats. Other days it held a revolving cast of boots and jackets, conversations low and unhurried. People didn't come to talk about him, exactly. They came to share weather, work, and the kind of wordless company small towns understand. Frank adjusted to it slowly. He still liked his solitude, but the door between him and the world no longer felt locked. In the evenings, after closing, he sometimes sat there alone with coffee, looking out at the highway. Trucks roared past in streaks of light, and he felt less like a forgotten outpost and more like a steady point on a map others traveled by. One late afternoon, as the first pale light of spring broke through, the young officer from that frozen night pulled in. He walked up with easy familiarity now, sat on the bench without asking. "Long shift," he said, rubbing his face. Frank nodded. "Car running, like new." A small smile. "You know they still talk about you at the station. About that night?" Frank huffed softly. "Stories get taller, maybe, but it helps the rookies. They hear about someone keeping things going when it's bad out there. Gives them something steady to hold." Frank didn't answer, but something in him settled hearing it. They sat a while longer, no rush. Just the quiet hum of tires and the faint smell of oil drifting from the open bay. When the officer left, Frank opened the ledger again and added a small note under the date. "Bench used. Stories shared." He closed the book gently, feeling its weight as more than just a record of repairs. It had become a record of belonging. That night he locked up, but before heading in, he paused on the bench alone. The horizon was darkening. Headlights stitched light across the flats. Somewhere out there, engines he'd touched were carrying people safely home. And somewhere downtown, the quiet recognition he never asked for still waited if he needed it. Frank leaned back, let the cold wood hold him, and allowed himself the rare gift of ease. Not celebration, not noise, just the steady knowledge that a life spent keeping others moving had not vanished into silence. It had come full circle and left something behind, a bench for resting, a wall for remembering, and a road that now ran both ways.